Okay, guys, so here we are on the second piece of the blood vessel and blood lecture. We are now going on to the major arteries, and we're going to be trying to follow the blood flow as it comes out of the heart. So just to get us started, all of the arteries, except for the pulmonary arteries, which will go to the lungs, all of them are going to branch off of one major artery. What is the name of the big artery emerging out of the left ventricle? That is the aorta. Okay, so if you're looking at this picture right here, the heart would be right about here, and coming out of the left ventricle is the aorta. Now the aorta is really, really big and it has a very, very, very thick tunica media, and that very thick tunica media makes it nice and solid and able to withstand the changes in pressure between the ventricles relaxing and then the ventricles contracting. So a big spurt of blood will go out into the aorta. Now let's look at the regions of the aorta. So you have the ascending aorta, then the edge of it is called the aortic arch, and then what does, instead of just going up, it actually makes a really quick U-turn. So as it emerges, it immediately just turns around, does a U-E right there at the top, and then goes back down, and it kind of travels back behind, underneath the heart, so posterior to the heart. That's called the descending aorta. And then it's going to pass through the diaphragm, so it's going to go from in the thoracic cavity into the abdominal cavity. At the point where it passes through the diaphragm, it's going to change its name. Instead of being the descending aorta, now it's called the abdominal aorta. Okay, so aortic arch at the heart, aortic arch at the top, then the descending aorta in the thoracic cavity, and then on the other side of the diaphragm, now we're in the abdominal aorta. Okay, so let's go through some of the blood vessels in the thoracic cavity. So here's your aortic arch. There are three, see these, right? Three main branches off of the aortic arch. You have the brachiocephalic trunk, you have the left common carotid artery, and then you have the left subclavian artery. By the way, for lab, always designate artery or vein. Okay, you won't get full points if you don't use artery. Okay, so let's talk about what those words mean. Okay, let's start with brachiocephalic. When you are looking at big scary words like that, you want to break them down into the pieces, and that will help you understand and remember. So the first one is brachio. Brachio as in brachial, which means arm. Okay, so that is going to continue out to the arm. And then a second branch will go up. Okay, so cephalic means head. Okay, this is your cephalid. Cephalic means head. Okay, so one goes to the arm, the other goes to the head. That's where the name brachiocephalic trunk comes from, or brachiocephalic artery comes from. Okay, now, next one, let's go and talk about the common carotid arteries are going to go up to the head. You have two of them. You have the right common carotid artery and the left common carotid artery. Now, in general, the arteries for the right and the left side of the body are going to be symmetrical with each other, so you don't need to designate right or left unless, this is very important, unless they are not symmetrical with each other. Okay, so for the common carotid artery, that means that you do need to designate right or left because they're not the same. The right common carotid artery comes off of the brachiocephalic artery, whereas the left common carotid artery is coming directly off of that aortic arch. So this piece right here, this would be the left common carotid artery. Okay, so let's talk about what this word common means. It'll come up later, but I just wanted you to understand what it means. Anytime the word common is in an artery name or in a blood vessel name, it just means that it's going to branch into an external and an internal artery. That's all it means. It just means it's going to branch into another one that'll be named it. So this, for example, this right common carotid artery is going to branch into the right external carotid artery and right internal carotid artery. Okay, so make sure you understand that those are asymmetrical with each other and therefore require the side for those. The second one that requires a side is the subclavian. Now let's break that word down. Sub means under. Clavian refers to clavicle. So what this does is, as it comes up, it's going to travel right underneath the clavicle. That's where the name comes from. So that is the left subclavian artery. The left subclavian artery branches directly off of the aortic arch. So again, this right here, this third one would be the left subclavian artery. Whereas the right subclavian artery, that one is also going to branch off of the brachiocephalic artery. Okay, so two major arteries that are not symmetrical, the common carotid and the subclavian. From there on, they're going to be symmetrical, so you won't need to tell me which is right or left. Okay, so for the subclavian, for both sides, the subclavian then goes into axillary. Does anybody remember then what does axillary mean? Which body region is the axillary region? That refers to armpit, okay? So auxiliary means armpit, and so what this is it's going to travel along the clavicle, well, underneath the clavicle, and then once it reaches the armpit region here, it becomes the axillary, and then from the, what it does is it kind of emerges out from underneath the rib cage. Once it's out from the rib cage, then it's the axillary because it's in the armpit. And then the axillary will pretty rapidly become the brachial. So it's only axillary in this armpit region. After that, it becomes the brachial region, which means arm. So you have the brachial artery that runs along the whole part of the arm. So again, above the elbow. And then once you get into this region here, the arteries are going to be named by which bone they run along. So you'll have the ulnar artery and the radial artery. So remember that the radius is on the thumb side and the ulna is on the pinky side. So radius is the lateral side and the ulna is the medial side. Okay, and then those are lead into the digital arteries that go to the fingers, little fingers. Okay, so what was the name of those two arteries that were not symmetrical and therefore require the right or left as part of their name? The first was the right and left common carotid artery, and the second was the right and left subclavian artery. All of the arteries, if they are symmetrical, you don't have to write right and left for the lab practical. Okay, let's practice. So you might want to pause the video real quick and see if you can figure these out, write them down, practice the words, and then we can go together. So first thing we need to do, get ourselves oriented. Like, what are we looking at right now? So here is the heart. On either side of the heart are the lungs, and so this whole area here would be the thoracic cavity. There is the rib cage right there, okay? So if the heart is here, this part right here, I know it's covered with a layer of fat on top of the pericardial sac. Okay, so we have the fibrous pericardium with a little bit of adipose tissue on top of that. So emerging out of the top of here, though, this right here would be the aortic arch. Okay, so here we have the aortic arch. Coming up from here, we have the brachiocephalic artery, And then the brachiosephartic artery then has two branches. One goes towards the arm, and then one goes up towards the head. What was the name of the one that goes up towards the head? That is the right common carotid artery. Okay, the right common carotid artery is going to go all the way up towards the head. And then the one that goes towards the arm is going to travel underneath the clavicle. So that would be the right subclavian artery. And then, so we already just said that C here would then be the brachiocephalic artery. Or you can use trunk, but I suggest you write artery. Okay, so the brachiocephalic artery. By the way, let's talk about what trunk means. I just got skirted over that before. A trunk is where you have branches coming off of it. So it's a major artery that has branches. So for example, you've already seen it with a pulmonary trunk coming out of the right ventricle. Okay, so pulmonary trunk, one goes up towards the head, that's the right common carotid artery, and one goes to the arm, that would be the right subclavian artery. Okay, so here is the right common carotid artery. So what is D? The second branch off of the aortic arch is the left common carotid artery, and then the third branch would be the left subclavian artery. Okay. Now, so the aortic arch goes up, does a UE, comes back down, the descending artery, but as it passes through the diaphragm, so this right here at the top, that would be the diaphragm here. Now we have the abdominal aorta. The abdominal aorta, sorry, the abdominal aorta. Now you don't need to designate a artery for the aorta because it's like the biggest one. So you don't need to say aortic, you don't need to say aorta artery, just say aorta. Okay, so we have the abdominal aorta here. The very first one coming off of it is going to be the celiac trunk. So immediately after it emerges from the diaphragm, which is that sheet of muscle that connects, that separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity, that is the very first branch of the abdominal aorta would be the celiac trunk. So again, you see trunk, that just means it'll have some branches coming up with that. The next one is going to be the superior mesenteric artery. Then we have the left and right renal arteries. Okay, what does renal mean? Renal means kidneys. Then we have the left and right gonadal, gonadal as in gonads. And so where they travel depends on whether or not you're male or female. If you are female, they'll go to the ovaries, which are usually right around here, kind of on the sides of them. If they're male, they actually travel all the way through, like outside the body wall and into the scrotum where the testes are. Okay, so if you know if it's a male or a female, you can call it ovarian artery or testicular artery. But if you don't, which you don't for these, for the diagrams, we call it the gonadal artery. So gonadal is sort of the generic, not male or female version. Then we have the inferior mesenteric artery and the right and left common iliac. Okay, so remember, common means comes out. So this is everything. I'm going to go through some of this in a little bit more detail. So I think that it's whenever you have a bunch of information in order, so it's always going to be in this order because that this is how it is. You can use a mnemonic device. Okay, so there's if you think of a really good one, let me know. But my favorite one so far that came from one of my students a couple of semesters ago is crocodiles seem really great in cages. Okay, so the first one, celiac trunk, would be crocodile. So crocodile, celiac trunk. Seem is superior mesenteric. Really as in renal. Great as in gonadal. In as in inferior mesenteric. And then cages as in common iliac artery. Okay, so it's going to be in order, so you can use a mnemonic device. Okay, so let's talk about the celiac trunk. So remember, it's called a trunk because it splits, it has branches, and it has 3 major branches that you do need to know. So the first one, here's the celiac trunk, okay, so that's right before any of the branches come out, that's the one that's going to be connected to the abdominal aorta. The first one that goes up is going to be the left gastric artery. So gastric, what is gastric referring to? Gastric is referring to stomach, right? So it's going to go up and then connect to and run along the inside part, which is called the lesser curvature. Whoa, whoa, whoa. The inside part of the stomach. Okay, so the left gastric, it always branches. They always show the branch going up because it's going to go up and hook onto the stomach. Now, the next one is the splenic, or splenic actually is how it's pronounced, but I like to say splenic because it goes to the left, and it's going to go far, far to the left and hook on and continue to the spleen. So if you ever have a chance to look at it in cadaver, if you pick the spleen up, you can really see this kind of wiggly looking blood vessel going all the way to it. Okay, so be careful though, even though I say splenic to remind myself that it goes to the spleen, there is only one E. So technically, actually, it would be splenic. The splenic artery goes to the spleen. Okay, so that one goes left, and the one that goes right is going to go to the liver. So whenever you see the word hepatic, hepatic means liver. Okay, so we have 3 branches. The one that goes up is the left gastric artery. The one that goes to my left is the splenic artery that goes to the spleen. And the one that goes right is the hepatic artery that goes to the liver. Okay. Now, let's talk about mesenteric. So we looked at 2 branches of the abdominal aorta have the word mesenteric in it. So what is mesenteric referring to? It's referring to the mesentery. So what these blood vessels are going to do is they're going to travel inside, embedded in that mesentery. That's where the name comes from. So the mesentery, remember, that is that specialized membrane that connects the intestines to the back of the body wall, so they don't just fall out. Okay, and so in this picture right here, what they're holding on to is the small intestine. So there's a small intestine. This membrane right here that has a bunch of blood vessels and some fat deposits in it, that is going to be the mesentery. And this blood vessel right here, the main one, that's the circular one there, that would be the superior mesenteric. So the superior mesenteric, which is that second little branch off of the aorta, that is going to travel inside of that mesentery along the small intestine, whereas the inferior mesenteric artery, that is going to travel along the large intestine and the bottom. Okay, so they kind of come up and sort of meet each other in the middle. But both of them are going to be embedded in that mesentery, and that's where their name comes from. So you have the superior mesenteric artery and the inferior mesenteric artery kind of creating this archway along the intestines. Okay, so let's practice real quick. So if what we're looking at in this picture is in a cadaver, if you take the intestines and you push them off to the side, we're looking at the back part of the abdominal pelvic cavity. Okay, so all the intestines, all the organs shoved off to the side. This is what it looks like. Okay, so this big one right here, so AA stands for abdominal aorta. And then the very first branch of the abdominal aorta, that would be the celiac trunk. Okay, so you can use celiac artery, but celiac trunk. And then the next branch, so crocodile seam, the next branch would be the superior mesenteric artery, and that gets going to go up to the small intestines. If you know where blood vessels travel to, it'll make it easier for you to identify those blood vessels. Okay, And then the next one, RA, stands for, where are they going? They're going to the kidneys. Another word for kidneys is renal. So those are the renal arteries. And then you have the left testicular artery, because this is a male. For us, we would call that gonadal. So there's your gonadal arteries there. So crocodile seam, really great. And then in cages. So the in stands for inferior mesenteric artery, and so that is going to travel to the large intestine, which is off to the side over here. And then cages stands for, so inferior mesenteric artery, and then in cages, C stands for common iliac artery. So I suggest that you try to go through this, because I think this is a good way to sort of challenge yourself and help you remember those blood vessels. Okay, so here we are moving on to what happens to the blood vessels at the other end of it. Okay, so here we are inside the abdominal pelvic cavity. The aorta, okay, so here's the abdominal aorta here. The aorta is going to branch into two common iliac arteries, okay? Anytime you see the word common in a blood vessel, that means it's going to branch into an internal and an external artery. Okay, so in this case, the common iliac artery, which came off of the aorta, will then further branch into the external iliac artery, which is this one right here. And then the internal iliac artery, which is going to go kind of down deep into, and this is going to supply into the pelvic region. Okay, so anytime you see common, you'll have an external and an internal version of it coming. Now, let's look at the difference between the external iliac artery and the femoral artery, because they're continuous with each other. The external iliac artery becomes the femoral artery, and the boundary for the name change is the body wall. So it's going to be traveling through the abdominal wall of the abdominal cavity. Okay, inside of the abdominal cavity, it's called the external iliac artery. Outside of the abdominal cavity, running along those blood vessels, kind of very superficial, then it's called the femoral artery. Then the femoral artery becomes the popliteal. What does the word popliteal mean? What region of the body is popliteal? That is the back of the knee. I call it the knee pit. That's just what I call it. Okay, so the very back of the knee, that's your popliteal region. So if we're looking at the muscles here, so here is your hamstring muscles here, and there's your gastrocnemius right there. There's a little area between them that's not covered with muscles. That's going to be the popliteal region, and in there you've got a nerve, which is the yellow one. You've got an artery and a vein, and the artery is going to be called the popliteal artery. So it's going to be always right behind the knee. Above the knee, it's called femoral. Below the knee, it's at the knee, I should say, it's popliteal. Okay, so location, location, location. Okay, so that is definitely enough for now. I'll do a separate one for the veins.